Star Trek. I think personally this is probably my favorite J.J. Abrams film. The action, the emotion, the comedy, the visuals, the music, I think all that just really just works. I really feel like, just me personally, this is probably like the peak of his career. Like later on, like his movies are kind of more like hit and miss, but I think this one's probably just the most solid out of all of them, just the most enjoyable, most rewatchable, just at least in my opinion. Right from the first shot, you're just kind of just like sucked into the story. It just starts off with like the whole Kirk's birth, and it's just like a routine mission from like the USS Kelvin starship, and then suddenly this giant like Narada ship, piloted by Nero, played by Eric Bana, just comes in and just attacks it just out of nowhere, because as we find out later on, classic Spock had a mission to save the planet of Romulan by using kind of like this red matter to kind of contain this black hole that was gonna destroy it. But then he gets there too late, Romulan gets destroyed, and he tries to put the red matter into destruction, close up this black hole, but he ends up getting sucked into it and then getting sucked to 25 years later, while the Narada, played by Eric Bana, who was a resident of Romulan, kind of gets sucked into the black hole and then gets sent back in time to the moment of Kirk's birth. So once he's attacking the USS Kelvin, he's actually going after Spock, and then his assistant kind of interrogates the captain. It's like, what year is it? And he says the date, and he's like, where are you from? And then Nero kind of gives the order, and then he gets killed. And then we kind of go on from there of the whole attack of the Narada onto the Kelvin. And then meanwhile, Kirk's mother is like pregnant with Kirk and about to give birth. And in order to give birth, she has to be taken onto the transports to escape, but then someone has to stay behind to pilot the ship in order to stop the Narada from attacking the shuttles. So James Kirk's father, played by Chris Hemsworth, which is really funny watching this, just seeing his acting debut in a way where a couple years later he'd be playing Thor, and then the rest would be history. But it's cool seeing this little cameo, the whole just emotional scene of him piloting the Kelvin into the Narada to kind of disable it while the shuttles go away. And then we have the whole like kind of Star Trek logo that comes up and the title that comes up. But yeah, it's just like right off the bat, you kind of get action, you get visual effects, you get emotion, and just a great score, and you just care about the character of Kirk, of like what's going to happen to him next. Now he has he doesn't have a father. He's kind of growing up kind of as this kind of rebellious kid in a way. Before watching this movie, like I didn't really know anything about Star Trek. I just knew like little hints here and there. I had a couple friends who were like huge Star Trek fans, who watched the original series and watched all the movies and everything. Like they were going in it with like these super high expectations, and I was kind of going in through with managed expectations. I love that teaser trailer. It just looked like a fun sci-fi action movie, and obviously it was Star Trek, so it'd be cool to kind of get into that fandom. Like as I've grown up, obviously more into Star Wars, which J.J. Abrams was more into, which is funny because like he grew up loving Star Wars, and he kind of wanted to bring Star Wars into Star Trek, because at first the whole backstory with Star Trek was it was like a kind of like a bidding dispute between like CBS and Paramount was about to lose the rights to Star Trek. In order to kind of retain those rights, they had to make a Star Trek film, because as the original movies went on, they're kind of like lowering down in quality, and people weren't really interested in Star Trek at the time, so they kind of really wanted to revitalize the series in a way. And the writers, Alberto Orsi and Alex Kurtzman, were just coming off of Mission Impossible 3, and they were kind of like the hotshot writers at the time. And they worked with J.J. Abrams, and who really, at first he just wanted to produce the film, he didn't want to direct it. And as they were developing this new iteration of Star Trek, they were obviously inspired by Star Wars, bring that kind of more action vibe into it. And then as they were developing it, JJ was like, oh man, I'm gonna be really jealous of the person who actually gets the job to actually direct the Star Trek movie. So then he was eventually decided to actually take on the mantle of directing it, and kind of went on from there. And I really appreciate like what they did with the characters, especially with Kirk and Spock, where Kirk is more of like kind of like the Han Solo type, kind of like the rebellious kind of bad boy, who's always against the rules. But then Christopher Pike meets him in the bar after he gets into that bar fight and says like, your father saved like countless lives on this Kelvin ship, I dare you to do better. And I remember watching that in the theater back in 2009, and just like that part just like hit me, just like, oh man, just as like just a person in general, like wanting to live up to these expectations that you're either your parents or your mentors have for you. And then that kind of like have that moment of realization where you really have to live up to your responsibilities. And I love that scene where he's like driving in the plains of Iowa, and he looks in the distance and sees the Starship Enterprise being constructed, and that really inspires him to join Starfleet and become a cadet, enlist and everything. I know an inspiration was Star Wars, where Luke Skywalker is looking out at the twin sunsets, and that kind of is kind of like his call to adventure in a way. So I appreciate how they kind of use that to kind of inspire Kirk to join Starfleet. And then meanwhile, on the flip side, you have Spock, who's half Vulcan and half human, and that's his whole conflict. That was like another thing that inspired me. Just like me not feeling like I had a place in the world, and having a character to identify with, like being pulled between two worlds, like where does he belong and all this stuff. So, and then his whole journey is like finding that balance. So I really appreciate Spock, where he's a boy from like two worlds, where like starts off as a boy and he's being bullied by the other Vulcans because they make fun of his mother because she's human, and then getting to a fight with them, and then him meeting up with his father, and he's saying it's really up to you to find out like what path you choose. And then him growing up, meeting with his mother, and saying no matter what you choose to be, like you'll always have a proud mother. So I thought that was really cool. And then you have these two characters clashing as they kind of get involved in Starfleet, where Kirk is very much like the rule breaker. He like bends the rules. He meets up with that kind of green Orion girl to help him cheat in the kind of Kobayashi Maru test, the test that kind of determines whether or not you can move on from being a cadet and then be put onto an actual starship. So he's kind of like bending the rules, and then obviously Spock is very like logical, practical, the rule follower, and then they have that kind of whole confrontation where Kirk's being accused of cheating, and then Spock brings up his father, and like what would you do in a situation where you had all these people following you on the ship, and you run into danger, and that whole conflict between them. It's like, do you choose like logic or do you choose emotion? And that's like another theme in like the original Star Trek movies, where like Kirk is very much like the bronze, and then Spock is very much like the logic, and then like their whole conflict that they have. I appreciate that they brought that into this movie as well. And the story kind of goes on from there. The whole attack on Vulcan, we have the whole backstory of like the Narada being captured by like the Klingons, and then escaping, and then having their kind of like vengeance on Spock. So it's like, okay, we have to capture Spock and send him to kind of like this ice planet, and then we're gonna have this whole revenge of like blowing up Vulcan, just like how I had to watch Romulan be destroyed, like you're gonna be stranded on this planet and then watch Vulcan be destroyed. So he attacks Romulan, Starfleet intercepts the distress signal, and they kind of go out, and then we have this whole kind of like epic action scene of Kirk and Sulu, played by John Cho, kind of going down into the drill to disable it, while the red matter that Nero destroyed, he drops it into the hull of Vulcan, and then they realize that Vulcan's going to be destroyed. So then Spock goes down to the planet to rescue, his mother and father and the other elders. Kirk and Sulu, after falling off of the drill and having that whole kind of like falling scene, they kind of get beamed up to the Enterprise. And then meanwhile, Spock gathers the rest of his family. But then, as they're being beamed up, part of like the rock face that his mom is on top of like breaks off. She falls down and dies, while the rest of the Vulcans are sent up to the Enterprise. And then, another big emotional scene where not only like was Captain Pike, taken, to kind of as like a distraction, he's not captain anymore. Spock is promoted to captain, and then, Kirk, has this whole confrontation with Spock of like, we have to go after Captain Pike, and then, Spock's like, no, that's not logical, get him off my ship. He gets sent to the ice planet, and then meets up with old Spock, who was stranded from the previous scene, and, they have to realize that they have to kind of get off of this planet, meet up with Scotty, get beamed up to the Enterprise, because old Spock's plan is to kind of get young Spock kind of like emotional and everything, and once he's emotionally compromised, then Kirk can assume the role of acting captain. So then they do all that, they meet up with Spock, they have their whole fight, and then Spock realizes that he's emotionally compromised, and then Kirk finally becomes acting captain, finally gets to sit in the chair, because I like how they have that scene of he's sitting in the chair when they're trying to plan what to do about Nero, and Spock walks up to him and is like, out of the chair. He's like, okay. So finally gets in the chair, then we get kind of like the third act of the whole rescue. Kirk and Spock are finally friends for now. They rescue Captain Pike, and then Spock flies one of the ships attempts to unleash the red matter. He kind of launches it into the Narada, but then just in time he's beamed out of the ship. So Kirk and Spock, reunite back on the Enterprise. Kirk's rescued Pike. Spock has unleashed the red matter, and then the red matter kind of destroys the Narada ship. And then we have that whole really fun scene where Kirk is saying hey, we can't help you, we can assist you, but you're gonna have to surrender. And then Nero's I'd rather die in agony than accept assistance from you. And then Kirk's you got it. And then he turns to Sulu and Chekhov and says fire everything we got, and they fire on the Narada, the red matter that caused the black hole, causes the ship to be destroyed. And then I really love that shot where all the sound goes out, and then it's just the music that swells up, and then it's just that kind of choral musical sequence, and then the Narada gets destroyed. The Enterprise is about to be sucked into the black hole, but then Kirk kind of gives the order to Scotty to go to warp drive, and then Kirk is do it, and then Scotty flips all the switches, fly out of the black hole, and then everything's saved. So yeah, it's really, really fun, climactic, epic action scene. And then we kind of wrap everything up. Old Spock reunites with new Spock, and then tells him about, hey, you knew about the future. It's you cheated. It's something that you have to do. You have to take risks in life. You have to, you can't just be logical all the time. This guy Kirk is going to be a really good ally for you, and kind of break you out of your shell. Switch over to a medal giving ceremony, kind of like an homage to Star Wars, where Kirk is finally be able to be captain, goes down the Enterprise, and then they kind of fly off into their 5-year mission. Have that whole voiceover by Spock of the classic Star Trek opening, fly off, and then end credits. But yeah, it's just a really fun movie. Just a lot of great humor, especially between Kirk and Scotty and Bones. I think the actors do a really good job at embodying the characters. After I watched this movie, I went back to the original series, and yeah, I think they really did a good job just playing younger versions of the original cast members. Carl Urban as McCoy, really embodied that character. Simon Pegg as Scotty, thought he did a great job as well. All the characters, Chris Pine, in his big acting debut, where kind of his career kind of goes on from here as Captain Kirk. I know there's a lot of controversy of how he played Kirk, the way that William Shatner plays it. He's I am William Shatner, and I play Captain Kirk on the Enterprise. And Chris Pine made a conscious decision not to play, not to do kind of his vocal inflections for that character, because it would kind of, border on the line of parody in a way. He kind of wanted to just have the spirit of Kirk instead of being Kirk, especially since this is kind of a prequel, kind of sets up how Kirk is. So I think he did a really good job playing, what Kirk would have been, especially, since this is an alternate reality in a way, something that the writers were wanting to do, where, they want to do a prequel, but not have the prequel rules, because it's oh, well, I know they don't die at the end because I see him in all these other movies. So they kind of wanted to have an alternate reality. So that's why they had the whole time travel aspect to it, where it would still be a prequel, but now it kind of shifts off from the main timeline into this kind of other timeline where it's the same characters, but they have different paths that could lead them to where they end up in the original series and everything. And also I feel it kind of frees up the writers and the creatives to tell their own stories rather than having to be kind of beholden to the lore and everything, which is something that J.J. Abrams was really wanting to do. It just has a production as well, the cinematography, this is kind of the start of the whole lens flare. I know there was a little bit of lens flares in Mission Impossible 3, but with this one, it's kind of open up the floodgates for lens flares and everything. And the whole theory was that the future was so bright that it can't be contained, which is what J.J. Abrams said. So that's why there's so many lens flares and stuff like that. And I remember reading a story that the editors, Marianne Branny and Mary Jo Marquis, were always upset with the dailies that came in, because they're just why are all these shots so overexposed? And then you realize oh, this is just a creative choice to have all these lens flares and stuff. So I thought that was really funny. And the fact that they wanted to update the interior of the Enterprise where it doesn't look how it did in the original series, but with this one, especially with modern audiences watching it, they probably wouldn't watch a movie a modern day 2009 movie that kind of replicates the original 1960s Star Trek aesthetic. So they wanted to kind of mirror it to make it look like like a futuristic Apple store or something. So like everything's like white and shiny and new, and you know how like in the opening with the USS Kelvin, where that mostly looks like the aesthetic of the original series, where it's just kind of like more like mechanical and just more, you know, kind of like worn down and rusted and everything. But with this one, you know, this is like, you know, bright, shiny and new future. Like I said before, like the editing was great, you know, very fast paced, you know, like there are a lot of like jump cuts and jump forwards, and you know, you really feel that kind of like that tension and that action and all that. And you know, the visual effects are great. You know, ILM, you know, worked on them. You know, who worked on like the Star Wars prequels and the Star Wars sequels, which JJ will get to a little bit later in his career. You know, I thought those were all great. You know, they also made a conscious decision not to use like models that they used in the original series, but really use, you know, like updated like visual effects and everything to recreate, you know, the starships and all that. You know, the fact that they actually doubled the ship length, where like the original ship, I forgot the actual specification, but it was like, you know, like one size, and then they actually doubled it in size, and they kind of like modernized the saucer section or like the engines and all that. And oh yeah, the costumes as well, where, you know, in the original suits, like, you know, they didn't really look practical. Like they were like uniforms and everything, but like this one, instead of having the Starfleet logo on there, it being kind of like a button or something, or they actually kind of knitted it into the actual material. And I appreciate that. It's kind of like more like a mesh material instead of kind of like a thin layer of clothing or something. So yeah, so I appreciate just like all the visuals, all the aesthetics, like how they kind of like modernize them, and, you know, just make it more like practical and real, kind of bring it into like, I guess, the 22nd century, which this movie takes place. But yeah, I thought those were really good too.